Only in America.
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 This week, we're taking a break from the relentless election news cycle to start the first meeting of the Only in America book club, and you're invited.
Obviously, I read all the classics, the American literature books in high school, and, from The Scarlet Letter to, William Faulkner, but, I didn't necessarily see how the world that I lived in, the world that I occupied, which was this very working class, immigrant world, of many different races, very diverse, within the pages of a book that other people would actually pick up and read.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Noorani, and this is Only in America. So, it's the day after the election, and I'm sitting in my home office in Washington, D.C., and what am I thinking about? I'm thinking about 4 years ago, November 9, 2016, the day after that election. On that morning, I wrote, "This was an election about culture, values, and who we are as a country." 2020 and this election we are experiencing right now is exactly the same. The differences between the candidates' visions for America could not be clearer. But at this moment, while I'm speaking to you, we don't even know the outcome of the 2020 election. So what I want to do is look past the election, because there are things we know to be true and people that give us a sense of what will be. 5 young women who grew up in rural Iowa, Joanne, Naomi, Laura, Lan, and Ophelia, gave me a glimpse of the future last week. From a Vietnamese refugee to a lawyer whose family has been in rural Iowa for generations, to a Latina who grew up going with her immigrant parents to Sioux City to make sure their immigration paperwork got processed. We know the rural Midwest is changing, just like the rest of the country. But we also know that change and leadership is coming from immigrant families and the native-born families who have come to love and support them. You know what? I feel good knowing that. Which is why this week on Only in America, we're having some fun with our first ever book club pick. The power of storytelling has always been part of America's immigrant narrative. It informs how we see ourselves as a nation and what defines and unites us as Americans. It's also a powerful tool for building support and empathy. A well-crafted story can help us see life through another's reality, bringing context to actions and decisions we might otherwise never really understand. It can help us understand why people flee their homes or how they came to be undocumented. A good story can educate us on our differences and remind us, in spite of these differences, how deeply connected we really are. Looking for more in-depth conversations on immigration? Join us on November 16th through the 19th for Leading the Way, the National Immigration Forum's annual convening. We're bringing together influential voices for critical conversations about immigration and its role in our nation's future. And this year, we're going virtual, so you can join us from wherever you are. Registration is free and open to all, whether you've only got time for one panel or every event. We'd love to have you be a part of the conversation. Visit leadingtheway.us to register.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. And from Humanity United. When humanity is united, we can bring a powerful force for human dignity.
We want to tell you about a new podcast called To See Each Other. To See Each Other is a documentary series that complicates the narrative about rural Americans in our most misunderstood and often abandoned communities. Host George Gohl, a leading grassroots organizer, travels to Michigan, Iowa, New Jersey, North Carolina, and Indiana to reveal how small-town folks are working together in fights for everything from clean water and racial justice to immigration rights and climate change. The show believes that when we see each other, we'll understand that we can never give up on each other. Subscribe to See Each Other wherever you're listening to this show.
Nancy Jooyoun Kim knows a thing or two about immigrant experiences in the U.S. and how telling these stories can bring a powerful narrative to a complicated topic. Her debut novel, The Last Story of Mina, was published in September. Since then, it's become a New York Times and USA Today bestseller, a Reese's Book Club pick, and the first only in America book club topic. I loved the book for its characters, its rich storytelling, and just the pictures of Los Angeles. As powerful as popular immigrant narratives are, they're often centered on inspirational or exceptional examples, and in turn, don't always convey the more common realities of life in a new country. In The Last Story of Mina, Nancy sought to capture the less celebrated or glamorized sides of immigrant stories. As she told me during our conversation, there's an inherent dignity not just in unlikely immigrant success stories, but in those of invisible sacrifice. The stories of those who work constantly, thanklessly, tirelessly, in the hopes for a better future for their families. Nancy and I talked about challenging the assumptions of the American dream and what she hopes readers will take away from her book. Nancy, first of all, thank you so much for joining. I absolutely loved your first novel, The Last Story of Mina.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor.
So before we talk about the book and kind of everything around it, tell me a little about yourself. How did you decide you wanted to become a writer?
I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I grew up in a very sort of working class household, single mother, immigrant, Korean immigrant mother. But I also grew up in a way that was extremely creative, and I sort of grew up in an artist family. And so in a lot of ways that promoted, reading, writing, anything that I was kind of interested in creatively. So I was really lucky in that sense. I think that's actually pretty rare in immigrant families. My mother was concerned about paying the bills and keeping the lights on, and we struggled a lot, but she sort of also helped foster an environment in which, she wanted me to do what I wanted to do, which was ultimately be a creative person. And so I was very fortunate in that sense. So I probably started writing when I was very young, like around 4 or 5, just kind of silly, cartoons that I would draw, things like that. And I started also writing poems as a sort of a moody, brooding teenager in Los Angeles without a dad. And, it was kind of wild in a lot of ways. And I would, remember just hanging out like in West Hollywood, like when I was like 13, 14 years old, like hanging out on the street, meeting up with friends. So it was a kind of an interesting childhood in that way. But I really didn't start writing fiction and imagining myself as a fiction writer until I started school at UCLA. And I began taking courses in Asian American studies. And that was really pivotal in allowing me to imagine a life for myself. And this was in the early 2000s, a kind of a life for myself as a creative Asian American, to see how I could write stories that sort of fit within this sort of larger, long history of creativity within the Asian American community. And so I was very blessed going to a school like UCLA that had such a dynamic Asian American studies program and ethnic studies programs, because it sort of gave me a sense of place and belonging that I couldn't have imagined for myself before that. Obviously, I read all the classics, the American literature books in high school, and, from the Scarlet Letter to like William Faulkner, but like I didn't necessarily see how the world that I lived in, the world that I occupied, which was this very working class immigrant world, of many different races, very diverse, within the pages of a book that other people would actually pick up and read. And so I was able to envision an audience for my work because of Asian American studies and because of Asian American literature, and also the ethnic studies courses that I took at UCLA. And so after that, I ended up doing an MFA in creative writing. That was a 2-year program. And after the creative writing program, I spent about 14 years trying to publish a book. So it's been a long road for me. Wow. It seems like, with a debut, there's so many different stories that you hear behind debuts. Sometimes it's, it's my first book and I'm 62 years old and I had this whole other career before this. I was kind of the person who was, quietly at office jobs. I'd always mention somewhere casually a drop-in that I was writing a book, but no one really took it seriously. And I secretly didn't want anyone to ever ask me about it because, anytime anyone asks you what your book is about, you kind of freak out and there's no easy way to describe what you're doing.
How much is the story of Mina and Margot, the 2 principal characters in the book, how much of your story is part of this?
So this book is not autobiographical in the sense that the series of events did not actually occur in my life. But in a way, it is very true to the complexities, the emotional and psychological complexities of my life and my relationship to my mother. And that's something that I wanted to, and that I hadn't quite seen before in books that are sort of about immigration, the ways that we not only need love, but also resent each other. And so I think that was a really strong and sort of powerful component of my relationship with my mother, who obviously, as a single mother, I love dearly and has made enormous sacrifices for me living in a foreign country, immigrating here, divorcing my father, then having two children to raise on her own. My father didn't pay child support, so she was financially doing everything from, working 80 hours a week, doing everything from, working in a kitchen at a Wiener Schnitzel, fast food places, to owning a clothing store and a swap meet. And so all of those realities of watching my mother sacrifice and feeling a constant sense of debt towards her, and at the same time being slightly resentful about the amount of debt that I felt towards my mother, having to take care of her in ways that I think that are very familiar to immigrant families. A lot of times kids from immigrant parents end up translating documents or sort of explaining things to their parents in ways that puts this enormous amount of, the relationships become very labor oriented, in my opinion. Like it's almost like transactional as opposed to emotional. And I think for a kid, for myself, having been born and raised in Los Angeles, that made me both, it made me feel so outside of the system of what I thought a parent-child relationship should be, which is one of support and love and like nurturing. And instead, my relationship with my mother, just like Margot and Mina, was very transactional in a way, because it was so much about labor and getting by, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that to me is very real. The complexities of my sense of debt towards my mother, growing up, the sense of resentment I had towards her, like wanting to have a mother who had time for me, wanting to have a mother who would ask me how I was doing today, how are things going at school? Because my mother did not do those things. I mean, she worked so hard, so many jobs. She worked midnight graveyard shifts, that to her, cooking and cleaning and feeding us was like the most she can do. And that was truly her best. And that it took me many years to realize that, obviously. Like now I'm an adult, I'm in my late 30s. And so I'm much more aware of the limitations that she had and how heartbreaking that was for her as much as it was for me, that I didn't realize when I was in my 20s. And I think Margot reflects that sort of, I think she's sort of considered ungrateful in many ways, right? And so that's something that I wanted to explore.
Right. So there's, I think it was last year, I had talked to Monica Castillo for the podcast. She was a film critic that often writes for the New York Times. And the same theme came up a couple of weeks ago in a conversation I did with Emily Gordon and Kumail Nanjiani. And in both cases, there were two things that came up that I wanted to ask you about how you wrestled with them as you wrote the book. One was, you tell a story of why somebody left, right? And you do it in a very, very nuanced and, like you said, complicated way. And it doesn't become clear till really towards the end of the book of why Mina left.
Right.
But then the other thing that we talked about in earlier episodes that you really grapple with in a very powerful way is that this is not the story of kind of your typical exceptional immigrant. Mm-hmm. This is a story of kind of, the reality of getting to the U.S., dealing with immigration status questions, trying to raise a family and surviving. So how did you grapple with those questions of kind of the story of departure, but then, did you feel the pressure of needing to tell the story of exceptionalism of the immigrant?
I didn't at all. And in many ways, this story is intentionally a kind of counter narrative to that sort of mainstream and more visible story, which is the story of immigrant exceptionalism. And I think is actually very harmful in a lot of ways, because it sort of equates a person's humanity with, the number of degrees that they have or the things that they contribute to society. Like we say, but, she wanted to be a doctor and her life was taken away, like things like that. While for me, I am more focused upon, and I think that in many ways, more people will relate to Mina's experience, which is, when I was writing this book, I wasn't thinking about the American dream. I thought about the American nightmare for some people more, which I think is the case for a lot of people these days, where people feel trapped. They feel like they are blamed often for their own misfortunes. They are blamed for, there's a concept of meritocracy that I think can often be very harmful for certain groups of people, because in reality, without the sort of safety nets and the institutions in place to support groups of people equally, it becomes actually very difficult to succeed by the standards of the American dream. And so Mina is a person who will work, and who dies at the beginning of this book. But if she were to have lived, she would have probably worked until she could possibly work. She would have probably still continued to live month to month, unsure, with complete instability in terms of like, who knows if I can always afford to pay rent? Who knows where I will live after this? I think that's a reality for a lot of immigrants in this country, a lot of communities of color, and just a lot of people in this country in general. And so in a lot of ways, I was trying to write a story that I related to deeply, which is a story of myself having grown up in very working class communities, myself having been one of the few people that I knew in some of those situations who actually went to college and was able to sort of establish like a middle class life. I was writing out of a sense of debt and a sense of responsibility towards the people who I know did not have the same opportunities as me. And I know that it was very unfair and that the system was kind of rigged against them in some ways. Mm-hmm. And so this book is, and when we're thinking about exceptionalism, I am more interested in the sort of ordinariness of the more, to me, a much more common American experience, which is, in some ways framed in this book as a mystery. There's this sense of entrapment that Margot continually experiences. Mina constantly feels entrapped in so many ways. And I think that that's actually a more common kind of emotional space for the average American these days, regardless of what your background is. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. We like to uphold sort of stories of exceptionalism because it makes us feel good about ourselves, or it makes us feel good about the system that we all invest in. But realistically, if we only tell the stories of the one, kid who grew up in this difficult situation and ended up at Harvard or, whatever, which is a story we love to repeat, it ignores the sort of the system that really kind of doesn't allow for the majority of people to experience that. And that was important to me. And that was definitely intentional in that sense. Yeah, I didn't want to write something that I was comfortable in that way.
What I also liked about the story about both Mina and Margot's identity in the U.S. was that it cut across cultures and races. They both had friends who were not Korean and both had experiences, good and bad, with folks outside of the Korean community. It just really stuck out to me as kind of bring a sense of realism to the story.
Yeah, I think that we often think of communities of color in sort of silos, like sort of Koreatown as, Korean American. But I wanted to show how so many communities overlap and in many ways sort of replicate the, as wonderful as ethnic enclaves are, and they provide opportunities for people who come to this country. In many ways, they replicate the sort of power systems that are also part of the larger social structure. So you see it within this case of my book, you have a Korean American grocery store owner who employs Latinx members of the community who are typically working in the back of the store. So they're less visible. They're probably less paid than the Korean American workers. And so some of the inequities that we see within the larger society, the divisions that are sort of created between communities of color are also sort of ethnic enclaves can sometimes be microcosms for those exact same hierarchies and structures. And we see that conflict, obviously over and over again, whether, there's some mention of, the Los Angeles uprising in 1992 in my book. So I'm particularly interested in not only the ways that different marginalized communities kind of overlap, but the way that they sort of don't know how to get out of the larger story, which is one of, how do we get out of these larger narratives of, in many ways in that grocery store, it's a story of exploitation that a Korean immigrant actually participates in and succeeds because of, his success is kind of based upon his ability to sort of enact the larger kind of power structures that are in place.
And immigration status is kind of this through line through, across almost every character in one way or another.
Yes, exactly. I'm very interested I think that it's really important that we look at, just the diversity of stories, the differences in our stories, but also the things that we have in common. At the end of the day, all of my characters in this book have different reasons for why they're here, but I think that they're all compelled with this kind of universal and very human desire to not only survive, but to connect with other people. And I think that's really powerful. So I hope that, through stories like this, we can think about at the core, we all have different immigration stories. We all have different things that push and pull us to this country. Some of us are pushed more than others and are, escaping persecution or, violence. There's so many reasons why people come to this country. But at the end of the day, it's a narrative of how people survive as human beings and how they are here in a way to protect their own sense of humanity, which could mean a lot of different things to some people. For most people, it's about protecting their families. It's about protecting their sense of self. I think in Mina's case, it was about psychological survival, because she fled a sort of tragedy that had happened in her life, many of the tragedies that had happened in her life in Korea. And so she came to this country as a form of not physical survival, but psychological, emotional, how to sort of maintain the integrity of her like mental state. And she needed to sort of move out to another space to do that.
Right, right. The conversations that Mina and Margot would have and would always have this obstacle of language. And there's one line that you wrote that just really stuck with me. You wrote, her daughter, Mina's daughter, would never understand why she couldn't make the time to learn a language that would never accept her, especially at her age now. And I just thought that point of the book really kind of captured everything that she was trying to do to survive and why she felt like the system and the language was set up against her.
Yeah, and what's really powerful in this story, we see how it begins with Margot remembering this conversation she has with her mother that she only understands half of because she doesn't know enough Korean to get. But she has internalized this sort of xenophobia and this concept. She's like, why doesn't my mother learn to speak English? So it's Margot who in some ways succeeds because she has internalized these concepts of that everyone who comes to this country should conform to a very specific set of rules and in order to be a quote unquote good immigrant. And that's how you kind of prove yourself here, right? And I think Mina, in so many ways, the way the system is set up is, she works so much and she knows that she will never leave Koreatown. She works in a mostly Latinx area. There's absolutely no reason for her to speak English. I mean, she doesn't really need it to get by day to day. And a lot of people who do live in places like Koreatown can get by day to day without speaking, English, which is the dominant language in our culture. But, I think the judgment that I think is really interesting that happens from the daughter's point of view, how in some ways in order to succeed, she has to kind of internalize these ideas of what her mother should be, not only as a mother, but as an American, which is she should learn English. She should do these things. And at the end of the day, I think we realize Mina had an extraordinary amount of humanity. In many ways, she was a very successful person considering where she came from, even though she lived day to day. And on the outside, we wouldn't consider her successful because she doesn't have like the status markers of being a homeowner or having a nice car or all of those things. As a human being, she managed to preserve herself and her sort of sense of gratitude and love for the human experience in a way that is extremely admirable. I mean, I think of her as a very successful person, but it's what happens in this book is a kind of conversion. It's Margot who needs to sort of realize those things because I think Margot in some ways represents sort of a mainstream idea of what success should look like and the expectations we should have upon people, which is my mother should learn English. I'm ashamed of her because she works at this swap meet. We're poor. I wish I could afford to have things. And that makes us less human because of that. So the book is really a journey of her countering the sort of more mainstream narrative of who she should be as a woman, as the daughter of an immigrant, et cetera. Yeah.
As you've been talking about the book now, what do you feel like is resonating most with audiences that kind of surprises you?
There are two things that really consistently surprise me. Is one of those is that I hear from people with very different backgrounds identifying with this book, completely different cultural backgrounds. They identify with the difficulty of the mother-daughter relationship. There's this kind of universality to it that I wasn't necessarily expecting. I'm just so surprised to hear people, they share their own personal stories and how they relate to my book, even though their personal stories are so different. So I love that. I think that's fantastic. And that's like one of the beautiful things that books and what fiction and storytelling can do. The second thing that really surprises me is how hungry people are reading my book, because that was never a thing. Like, I feel like everyone feels like I did that to them and I did it to torture them. And I was trying to make everyone hungry because of the food descriptions.
And
That
especially at a time
complete,
when it's so hard to go get
yeah,
go out to a restaurant and get a good Korean meal. Thank you.
exactly. Yeah, I'm so surprised by that because that was not. I mean, I feel like food is a sort of a form of communication in this book. It's an obvious form of communication in that way because when you think about it, we have so little time to connect these days. Most of the time, it is through food. Parents and children, they like to sit down at meals together. Sometimes that's the only 20, 30 minutes that they'll see each other during the day. And so food is a very powerful way of communicating not only interpersonal sort of politics, but also the sort of intercultural things that are happening at the table. So food was very natural to me, but I feel like people are really, they love the food. They're really into this. I'm so surprised like how hungry people are. It's amazing. I don't know if it could be, maybe it's pandemic related. Maybe it's because people feel restricted. Like,
Or
they
maybe
have
it's just because you're a really good writer and you just,
I don't
there's
know.
also
That
that.
was surprising to me. It continues to surprise me, and I love it. I mean, I think that's great.
In your mind, what happens? Where's Margot in 10 years?
Oh, that's such a great question. I see her as someone who has just a stronger sense. I think she realizes that she has so much more internal resource than she's ever realized before. I think learning about our parents is not just about learning about who they are and why they treated us a certain way and why they made certain decisions, but it also provides this sort of opportunity to realize that we, through the process of knowing our parents, have internalized also their various strengths. And I would love to see Margot as somebody who is much more sure of herself, much more proud of her background, somebody who can incorporate her background into her everyday life, into her art, and to realize that she was extraordinarily loved, even if it wasn't in a way that she wanted to be loved. I think that there was a lot of love between her and her mother, and just to sort of, have this sort of openness about her. And I hope that we end the book with that feeling for her, that she is on the sort of brink of, it's a kind of rebirth in a way. We don't really get to connect with her so much emotionally in this book. And I think it's because after the trauma of discovering her mother's body, she becomes sort of driven to discover what had happened to her mother, both in life and in death. And there's this level of dissociation that's happening for her. But I hope that she spends the rest of her life sort of connecting to her feelings and what she felt and connecting to her mother in various ways and sort of realizing, the sort of depth of what the sort of depth of experience that she has had because of her mother.
And do you think she and Officer Choi go on to live a happily ever after?
I left that as open as possible. I don't know if I can answer that because, I didn't want her identity to be reliant. I thought that, I think it's a lot of fun. I think they have fun. So we'll put it that way.
She ended up changing him, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah, because I think a lot of this book is about the ways that we create mirrors for each other without even realizing it, the impact that we can have on each other without even realizing it. I think her standing up for herself allowed him to realize that there were different ways that he could stand up for himself as well and sort of change the narrative of his life. And so that's one of the things that I do love about just this concept of mirroring and the fact that we have on each other the tiny interactions that we have with strangers every day, which we all miss so much because of the pandemic. The gestures, like the taxi driver in the beginning of the book who sees, Mina in the back seat of his cab, and he's like, he realized this woman is coming to this country all alone, and he doesn't want to accept payment from her. He's just like, I'll see you again.
Yeah, that was a beautiful scene. I'd forgotten about that.
Those like sort of gestures like have a very powerful effect on people, and I hope that that's part of what this book wants to celebrate. That kindness is not overrated. And we have the potential to sort of reach people through our actions, the sort of small bits of benevolence we can sort of put into this world, no matter what we might or might not have in common with them on the surface.
Yeah. Well, I gotta say, it's been an honor to celebrate this book as the first, Only in America official book club book.
Oh my gosh, what an honor. Thank you so much. This is such tremendous conversation. Wonderful questions. Thank you.
But I have one more question for you.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's just a request to finish this sentence. Only in America, ...
Only in America could I have written a book like this. I think only in America could I have written a book that combines so many different cultures, the beauty of so many different sort of human interactions on a daily basis between people who might not even speak the same language. Only in America could we read books like this and create them, in my opinion. So I think this is what we're trying to preserve, right?
Nancy, thank you so much for joining, and everybody out there, run to your nearest bookstore and pick up a copy of The Last Story of Mina.
Thank you so much for your time.
Nancy Jooyoun Kim is a writer and editor. Her debut novel, The Last Story of Mina Lee, has been met with critical acclaim. You can learn more about Nancy and how to purchase her book at our website, immigrationforum.org/podcast. And stay tuned next week for a post-election conversation with Robbie Jones of the Public Religion Research Institute. If you like what you hear, subscribe to Only in America wherever you're listening to this episode. And finally, Only in America is produced and edited by Joanna Taylor, Megan Wetmore, and Becca Wall. Our artwork and graphics are designed by Carla Leha. I'm Ali Nirani, and I will talk to you next week.